church planter can walk 20 miles in a day. Give him a bicycle and he can go 3 times as far and be 3 times as effective. It is so nice to be together one more time as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. You probably knew I was going to say that if you're a regular watcher. Today we're back in the book of Acts, in the 2nd chapter. Actually, when we were together last time, we were talking about the idea of biblical poverty. What do I mean by biblical poverty? That is, poverty by biblical standards. Those of us who live in the Western world today are living in an age unprecedented in all of human history, when so much wealth has been created and is enjoyed by members of many countries around the world, that we really lost touch of what poverty really is. And the people that we often define as being poor in our country, our countries, depending on where you live, are often not poor by biblical standards. So biblical poverty could be defined very simply as not having the real necessities of life. What do I mean, real necessities? Food, clothing, and covering, really. You need to eat, you need to have some clothes to wear, and you need to have a roof over your head or someplace where you can stay that's somewhat secure and protects you from the elements, if there are elements to be protected from. And when the Bible speaks of the poor, it often speaks of them, within that context, makes it very clear. And as we were looking in Acts the last time, these passages in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, let me read briefly Acts chapter 2 again for you, verse number 44. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. What all things? All the things that they possessed. What kind of things did they possess? Well, I went through a list of things they didn't possess, all the modern conveniences that we have and take for granted today. Okay, so they just had the basics. They might have had more than they needed, and that's what they shared, but they didn't have what we might have to share because we enjoy such a high degree of wealth. They began, verse 45, selling their property and possessions. Doesn't name specifically what they are, but you could own land, you could own a house, you could own some furniture, you could own some utensils and tools and so forth. And they were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. Now, this is elaborated a little bit more in Acts chapter 4, because we read in verse number 34, for there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales, lay them at the apostles' feet. They would be distributed to each as any had need. And so you can be sure that they weren't, they were selling these possessions and providing the basic needs of those who didn't have those basic needs. They weren't selling their houses and giving them money so other people could buy houses. They weren't selling their land so other people could have the money to buy land, right? Right. And so that's what we ought to be focused on in our charitable giving. When I hear stories, for example, it wasn't so long ago I was watching the evening news, and they were talking about tough times, during these tough economic times, and they were interviewing one family. It was a family with a mom and a dad and several kids, and they were talking about how because the dad had lost his job and only mom was working now, how they've really landed on tough times. And the lady was almost in tears, saying, we're having a hard time, we had to cancel the cable TV and other things that, again, you could have some sympathy for them. But for those of us who have walked through the mud huts and the squalid slums that are unfit for human habitation throughout different places in Asia and Africa, we have a different perspective on, are these people really, really hurting? And the things they're having to sacrifice are things that nobody ever dreamed of having, just 100 or 200 years ago, okay? So it's not quite as tough as they might think it is, by comparison. All right, so how are we going to help the biblically poor if there's none around us? Well, we have to go where they are and find them and recognize that we're kind of living in a bubble world. I call it Disneyland, where we're just living in a fantasy world compared to so many other people in the world. If half the world lives on less than $2.50 per day, right, and they do, then you can probably guesstimate that about half of the people who know Jesus Christ live on less than $2.50 per day, right? Right, okay? So there's lots of people out there to help, but we have to go to them. And chances are you're not going to be traveling to Africa this year. You're not going to be traveling to any poor places in Asia this year. If you go on vacation, even to Africa, you're going to go to the tourist spots. You're going to avoid the poverty. If you go to Africa, you're going to go to some game parks. You're not going to go and visit a slum in Nairobi. All right. But there's lots of Christians in all those places, and there's ministries like Heaven's Family that are involved in ministering in those places. You might know missionaries who are ministering in those places. Well, you can connect with them to be a blessing to the ones whom Jesus defined as being the least of these, those who are truly poor. Does that mean there's anything wrong with helping out someone in your church who lost their job and struggling to, make their car payment? Well, that's debatable. Nothing wrong with it, okay? Except that it's just the rich helping the rich. Really? Sure it is. Can I just read you one scripture here briefly? This is from Luke chapter 14 and verses 12, 13, and 14. I think it speaks to this issue. Jesus went on to say to the one who had invited him to his house, they were having a meal there, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite, now listen to this category, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. See, these are the really disadvantaged people, and they're going to be poor by virtue of their handicaps and their circumstances. And you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So let's be careful, okay, that what we call giving to those less fortunate is really just giving to the rich, while we just completely ignore those who are biblically poor, truly unfortunate, okay? And we'll talk about this just a little bit more the next time we're together. I just have a little more to say, so I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.